All right, here we are with another lecture video in philosophy and film. The topic of this lecture is part 2 of Other Minds, which will look at the metaphysical problem of other minds. Last time we looked at the practical problem. This time it's metaphysical. And we'll also look at the school of psychology known as behaviorism, which actually arises from the fact that we have the problem of other minds. So, just to review, the cause of this problem is the fact that you have direct access only to your own thoughts. You know your own mind directly. Other people's minds we know indirectly. We can't feel what they're feeling, think what they're thinking, so we have to infer based on their conscious and unconscious behavior. The metaphysical problem, though, is the problem of knowing whether or not something actually has a mind at all. Okay? In this case, it's something that maybe looks like something that doesn't have a mind, but is acting like it does, and then we wonder if it has a mind. Or it's something that we think should usually have a mind, but isn't acting like things with minds should act. So the examples will make this clear. So the question is whether or not we can know for sure if something has a mind. That's a problem. So Frankenstein's monster, he looks human, but we wonder maybe because of the way he was put together, whether he actually has a mind or not. He behaves like something that has a mind, but we still might be wondering, is this creature, this monster, is he sort of like a zombie or something that doesn't have a mind, it just has behaviors? Now we see in the film, we see him reacting to things like light and fire and other things, and we think, wow, that's the way something that had a mind would act, and he does look a lot like a human. So maybe he has a mind. Maybe we don't know for sure. Now, another area where this problem, metaphysical problem of other minds arises is in AI, or artificial intelligence. This is where we have something that's a computer, but we've been able to write programs that allow it to act as if it has a mind. Maybe it could do this so well that it could even fool us into thinking it has a mind. A famous test that was developed a long time ago by a great computer scientist named Alan Turing is what's known as the Turing test. Now, the test is of something to see whether or not we could say it has a mind. How does this work? Well, on one side, on the bottom side, there's someone who is typing on a keyboard and looking at a screen and communicating with something on the other side of this wall. But the person who's doing the typing at the bottom doesn't know whether he's talking with a person or with a computer. So asking questions, keep asking questions, see if you can figure out. And so Turing's suggestion was that, well, if the computer could fool a human into thinking it had a mind, then it would be behaving exactly like something that had a mind. And so maybe we would have to say that it does have a mind, because we don't have direct access to other people's thoughts and feelings. We only can go by their behavior. This thing is behaving exactly the way a person would act. And it doesn't matter whether it was programmed or not. A lot of people would say that human beings are programmed by their DNA and by their life experiences to behave a certain way. And a computer could be programmed by whoever wrote the code, and then other experiences and other data and info that enter into the system. So we could say, well, do computers have minds? They may not look human unless we make a robot that looks kind of human, but they may not look human, but they may act exactly as a human acts. Another case where this metaphysical problem of other minds arises is in persistent vegetative states. And this is a case where, well, this looks like a human being, but it's not behaving like one. And this is because of some kind of traumatic brain injury. And so we may wonder about removing life support from someone because we're saying, well, they're not acting like they have a mind exactly, but I think maybe they still do. Maybe there's some part of them that's still in there. So, well, their behavior maybe is not showing this. So we could use neurological analysis and look at their brain patterns and say, well, the behavior of their brain is not what we would expect of something that has a mind. And then their physical behavior is not consistent with that. So maybe we'd say, well, they don't have a mind, so we wouldn't be harming them by removing life support. But a lot of people want to still say, well, even though they're not acting like something that has a mind and their their neurological behavior isn't consistent with something that has a mind, we'd say, well, they still look like this person that I used to know. And so again, the question, do they have a mind or not? So those are two areas where the metaphysical problem of other minds arises in persistent vegetative states and in AI. Now, talk about science for a minute and the goals of science. But science requires observation. You have to be able to see something to measure it before you can apply science. That's how we test hypotheses. We come up with some kind of hypothesis. It predicts some observable phenomenon, and then we check to see whether that happens, and then either confirms or disconfirms our hypothesis. For psychology, the big problem is, well, can we observe other minds? Well, it appears that we can't. We can only observe what? Well, behavior. So we can't really study minds, even though psychology is supposed to be the study of mind. Really, all we can study is behavior. So in that case, psychology really becomes the study of behavior, right? Because that's all we can observe. So this led years ago to a school of psychological thought known as behaviorism. The idea is that, well, all we can observe is behavior. So we can look at how somebody's acting before we do something to them and how they're acting afterwards, or with an animal or something, and see, well, they do this, they do that, and we could say, well, we've changed their behavior, but we can't see what's there in the middle. We can't see if there are thoughts or feelings or anything. All we see is how they're acting before we stimulate them and then how they're acting when they're stimulated. So it's a stimulus response. And this led the behaviorists to this view on education that we do it through conditioning, through different kinds of positive and negative reinforcement. We could call it punishment and reward. I don't want to get all into the psychology jargon here, but that's the basic idea. So B.F. Skinner, a famous behaviorist, came up with this device he called the Skinner box. So he'd try to teach rats and mice how to respond to change their behavior. So there's electric shock on the bottom, and then there's food pellets. So you got a negative and a positive reinforcement, a reward and a punishment. And that's the sort of thing you do to try to change his behavior. You speak some command, and if he pushes the right lever, you would give him a reward. If he pushes the wrong one, you'd give him something else. So change behavior by reinforcing the behaviors we want and by trying to get rid of behaviors we don't want. So you see this pretty prominently if you've ever tried to train an animal. You do it through reward. Usually reward is the best way to do it. Animals respond best to that. Give them a treat. You may click on a clicker, give them the treat. Eventually you don't have to use the treat or the clicker anymore. Just the verbal command is enough to elicit the behavior that you're trying to get them to do. And with humans, we might think of this in terms of punishment. Now, one of the problems with punishing humans in a legal system is that the punishment often follows long after the crime committed. So basically, we're sort of training people to avoid being caught rather than to avoid doing the crime. So like if you're trying to train your cat not to get on the dinner table, you want to squirt it with the water right when it gets on the dinner table, not wait 6 months later and then squirt it with the bottle, because there's not going to be the connection made. The same might be with punishment. It might be a problem why punishment doesn't often seem to work. Like I said, we're reinforcing the tendency to avoid getting caught rather than to avoid doing the crime. But anyway, the basic principle is the same. It's behavioristic principles. Like you do something bad, you get pain. You do something good, you get pleasure. And that's how we change and model and orient people's behavior in the direction we want it to go. And one area where this is really successful is in marine basic training, where you take guys who maybe never made their bed in their life and you put them through this rigorous training, and they come out being able to do quite well in various tasks after having been sort of broken down and then built back up to be trained. And of course, one thing that the drill sergeants do is yell in the face of the recruits, and people naturally don't like yelling. And so maybe if you get yelled at, when you don't make the bed correctly, then you make the bed correctly, you don't get yelled at. So you're trying to remove that negative stimulus from the environment, which is the person yelling at you. So it is back to the sort of Skinner box sort of scenario. Now, one possible viewing for this lesson is Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. It's a war film, but the beginning of it deals with the basic training of Marine recruits. Now, it's pretty intense, and so I'm not requiring it, but it's certainly a classic film. But it is, like I said, it's intense in terms of language and violence and things like that. But it does really show very well how this positive and negative reinforcement, this reward and punishment type of conditioning, is used to try to get these young men to become well-trained Marines. And also we see how maybe in all cases this kind of training has the sort of reverse effect, or doesn't have the intended effect that we want it to have. Okay, so that does it for this lecture video on problems of other minds.